Welcome. In this part of the course, we're going to be talking about the role of information and communication technology in restoring the well-being of people and planet. Is that possible? How can it be done? How can it, instead of being a driver of unsustainability, how can ICT become a driver of sustainability? My name is Arjen Wals. I work for the Education and Learning Science Group at Wageningen University, and I'm co-teacher of this course, and I wish I could be interacting with you more, but due to the corona crisis that we're in at the moment, which you can see as a manifestation of a much deeper crisis, I would argue, I have to resort to doing it by video. Let me apologize right away. I'm going to unload a lot of issues in this first short lecture, which may be overwhelming a bit, but I hope to get through it in a reasonably clear way. First, the outline. There are two sessions. This session talks about systemic global dysfunction, the Anthropocene. How do we engage with the so-called wicked problems in the post-truth era? How do we respond through education, learning, capacity building? Learning-based approaches is really where my group is focusing on, and how can those approaches be supported by digital technologies is one aspect of that. And in the second session, we move away from the problem identification, so to say, towards the more the prospects and the possibilities for mobilizing ICT in a positive way. First off, you come from different backgrounds within Wageningen University, a life science university. You're mostly in the social sciences, I suppose, but all of you are aware of the severe nature of the sustainability crisis that we are facing today, whether it is the mass extinction of species that we are witnessing today, or whether it is the massive explosion of toxifying products such as plastics of all kinds. Where, you know, this picture shows, and it's an example of how diversity of consumer products is exponentially growing, while biodiversity is dramatically shrinking at the same time. And since we do not have a circular economy, and we do not have a cradle-to-cradle approach to the materials that we use, we see a lot of that disappear, or not really disappear. In fact, it hardly ever disappears, but break up into smaller pieces at best, entering, in this case, the plastics in our waterways, rivers, streams, and the oceans, and in smaller parts in the nano parts and the micro parts entering also in soils and waterway, and in our bodies even, and the bodies of other species. So along things like the plastic soup, climate change, these are all what you could call manifestations of a deeper crisis. It has to do with how we live on this earth, and how we are not able to find a kind of dynamic equilibrium that allows us to live within ecological boundaries, while maintaining a good quality of life for all people in an equitable, social, and fair way. In part, the fact that we are on a trajectory that is leading us towards an unsustainable world has to do also with vested interests in maintaining the current system, which is based on and I know this might be a topical conversation and dialogue and deconstruction, if you will, but it's based on extraction, on fossil fuels, and there are vested interests that would like to maintain the system as it is, for either for short-term gain or for profitability or increasing shareholder value, which may benefit some in the short run, but may not be beneficial, or actually we know that it won't be beneficial for all people on this earth, and it is harmful at the expense of other species and of future generations. Some of the doubt around loss of biodiversity or climate change is intentionally created. Merchants of Doubt is a famous book about this. How do we inform the public in a way that they can be critical of information and kind of dissect where information is come from, and understand that there is nudging and social marketing and commercial marketing taking place that may not serve the interest of people and planet, but may serve other interests that are not sustainable. Here's an example of the climate myths that sometimes can be created also by popular leaders who will equate climate change as a hoax, or global warming as a hoax, or as a product from another foreign power, and so on. And this is making communication, education, capacity building for a more sustainable world more difficult, because as a result we lack trust in government, we lack trust in science, and people might be confused, and confusion can be used as an excuse not to change. It may also lead to people withdrawing altogether from democracy and politics when they see that they don't have power over any of these things, and that in a more fatalistic way life is being predetermined by powers that are beyond our own capabilities. And this is a dangerous response, because it can lead to apathy, powerlessness, and a withdrawing from these critical issues. And in this part of the course, we do talk about what is then the role of ICT, of social media, in either amplifying these kinds of myths or these kind of false truths, fake news. How does it go viral? How do people dialogue, interact around these issues? How do they stay in bubbles, or how can they go out of bubbles in order to become exposed to divergent ways of viewing things, and more critical analysis of what is going on in the world today? European Union has a project, supported a project that is trying to help people understand viral nonsense, fake news, clickbait, how sponsored content and the cookies we accept is kind of planting the seeds in our minds of what we want and what we need and what we want to buy, who we trust, who we believe. And in some ways it can take over our minds and can even predetermine our futures, as you may have already seen in the video of Douglas Rushkoff that I will mention in a minute, about reclaiming the now and how our futures are being predetermined by the cookies we accept. And that is a dangerous phenomenon. We live in an era where, and some people would say, facts don't matter. And this one, you may not be able to read it, but here the quiz master is saying, "I'm sorry, Jeannie, your answer was correct," but Johnny shouted his incorrect answer over yours, so you get all the points. And this is kind of another sign of our time, that the ones who are able to frame things in a crisp and short manner, who are able to have the loudest voice or the most followers, are the ones who have a lot of influence. And this is something we need to be thinking about when we talk about the digital age and how it can amplify unsustainability unwillingly, which is also happening in an age of what we call commodification, where everything is seen as a product that can be traded and sold, just like data are being mined, and algorithms are being produced that kind of help or influence human behavior in ways that serve particular interests, where we lose our ability to be autonomous, to have self-determination, and to kind of co-create our futures together based on values and principles that are not at the expense of others, people maybe in other parts of the world, or of other species or future generations. So it's the commodification of everything that includes the World Wide Web, which is supposed to be a public World Wide Web. But it also happens to water that is commodified, whether it's bottled water that is easier to get in some parts of the world than in tap water, or whether it's the commodification of land or of air. You can buy even oxygen that is in canisters, packaged in canisters if you need to have fresh air. Vitality Air is a company that does that, for instance. But it's also, even education is commodified, where students become input, throughput, and output. And this is a dangerous phenomenon because it kind of blocks our ability to become and to be human. I shall not get into the commodification or the globalization that is orchestrated by companies that are getting bigger and bigger all the time and have GNPs bigger than they have a turnover bigger than many countries in the world, and in fact they are the ones influencing a lot of governance and a lot of public money at the moment. For instance, in the Corona crisis, a lot of public money is being used to bail out private interests, and that shows that there's a lot of power of these companies in determining what is of the best interest to us, the citizens. And of course, citizens are also part of these companies. It's not that binary as I make it sound now. Another effect that the technologies have is that they become we're so glued to our devices, and we try to be more and more, and fortunately there's a counter trend, but we more and more see our own identities through the screens that we watch. And this is it's a well-known, almost cliche figure of the Titanic going down, and people more occupied with capturing the moment and bringing themselves to safety, because they're more interested in the number of potential likes that they get from sharing that video than in saving themselves. And we recognize pictures like this where people are disconnected from where they are and with whom they are, and they don't develop a strong connection with place or with people anymore. Not even with their own child, or not seeing the elephant in the room, literally on the lower right side, which is that the technologies alienate us from ourselves and from the world. And optimists would argue that it does the opposite too. It can improve those connections, and maybe it can. We'll see that in session 2. But it's clear that we need to be critically assessing the power of technology and ICTs in general in establishing or diminishing relationships. E.O. Wilson, the famous biologist, once said, "We are drowning in information while starving for wisdom." So one question is, how can information and communication technologies, how can they make us not more knowledgeable per se or have more access to information, but how can we make wiser decisions about who we are, what kind of future we want, and what kind of world we leave behind for future generations. That is a critical question in education, learning, communication for sustainable development, and that is the field that I am active in with colleagues within the Education and Learning Sciences group at Wageningen University. Douglas Rushkoff, this is in Dutch, but in Dutch it says de herovering van het nu, which means how do we reclaim the present. He argues that the present, he's a media theorist, a critical media theorist. The interview is in English. You can find it if you Google Douglas Rushkoff and VPRO. you will find this video, and the students in the class already have access to it. It's a fascinating interview about the always on society, where people are being companies are looking for eyeball attention, and they want you to go back to your screen. And when you go back to the screen, there are companies making money of you being there. But when you're taking a walk in the forest, that's not the case. So eyeball attention and captology, the science of capturing your eyeball attention, are becoming more and more important at the moment. And he talks about the side effects of that and the negative consequences it has for our well-being. Kate Raworth, the economist from the UK, sees the challenge that we have today as learning to live within the ecological ceiling that is comprised by the planetary boundaries that have to do with ecosystems, climate, ozone layer, quality of the air, biodiversity, freshwater availability, nitrogen, phosphorus loading, and so on. While having a social foundation that allows for healthy food, that allows for political voice, good education, gender equality, as a foundation for a quality living. So we need to find a safe and just space for humanity by having a more regenerative and distributive economy. So the Sustainable Development Goals that you are familiar with, I think, they kind of fit in this donut, with on the outside the more planet-oriented ones, and in the middle the more people-oriented ones, and prosperity-oriented ones. And the challenge is, how do we use education, learning, capacity building in finding a way to live within that safe and just space for humanity? And what, in this course, what is the role of communication technology, digital communication technology, in doing that? So given today's global challenges, can ICT supported learning disrupt hegemonic mindsets, routines, and values into ones that lead to a more sustainable way of living? That is a key question that we should be asking ourselves today, and that's what I'd like to focus on a little more for the next 3 minutes. So this picture, in a way, says it all. You know, from an education perspective, we are the students of today, attending the schools of yesterday, being taught by the teachers of the past with methods from the Middle Ages to solve the problems of the future. Of course, this is a bit cartoonesque. So there's lots of teachers and schools all over the world that do wonderful work, so I don't want to diminish that work, but this is, it kind of outlines the problem that we are facing. In part, we need to kind of replace an old-fashioned way of an old-fashioned view of learning, where we see knowledge as something that can be packaged and kind of transferred to another to another person who is a consumer of that knowledge, who is an empty vessel that needs to be filled somehow. I think, therefore, I am approach kind of leads us to a perspective, to a world where we are very good at dissecting and drawing boundaries and distinguishing disciplines and categories and sectors in society. So we're very good at distinguishing the wholes. I mean, distinguishing the parts, but we're not very good in seeing the wholes and seeing that the sum, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So on the right side of this picture, you see a more integrated, holistic, dynamic, relational way of being in the world. That we have kind of lost, and that our education is not emphasizing much. And we need to kind of reclaim that and develop that and strengthen it in order to become more sustainable. and to see relationships and interdependencies and connections, and to develop an ethic of care. So a more social view of learning, where it is about participation. We participate, therefore we are. So it's not I think, therefore I am. We participate, therefore we are. So understanding is socially constructed, you could say, and out of that comes the wisdom that we need. So we need to move beyond textbook learning. It's not about learning about, it's more about learning to be. And maybe we could go further, learning to make change, learning to transform, learning to care. And that means that we're not just learning about explicit knowledge that can be kind of described, defined, transferred, and reproduced on an exam, but it's really about the deeper dimensions of learning that include our values, that include our emotions and our intuitive ways of knowing, but also not just scientific ways of knowing, also local knowledge, indigenous ways of knowing, and connecting these in a more dynamic way is what can lead to a more sustainable way of being in the world. So we need to reverse the flow or make it more circular approach where we connect the explicit and the tacit knowledge, where we create things, we reflect on those, what we create, what's working, what's not working, how does it make me feel, what's keeping us from changing, and what is helping us in changing. And this needs to be kind of promoted in a more open knowledge exchange, where we can share experience and evidence to improve practice. Again, what is the role of education, communication, and in this particular course, how can the digital information and communication technology, the internet, social media, help with that? One article that you will find in the reader is about serious games as a catalyst for boundary crossing, collaboration, and knowledge co-creation in a watershed governance context. And it talks about how to link the tacit and the explicit knowledge, and how to socialize, how to combine socialization, externalization, and internalization, and to how to combine these forms of explicit knowledge and link them to more complex explicit knowledge, but also how to move from explicit knowledge to tacit knowledge, and to move from tacit knowledge to explicit knowledge. Too much to go into now. The whole person needs to be engaged in sustainability. Also, when we design ICT, we need to think about all these components, from the grounding, the connecting to place, and our embodied understanding of the world, to how we take action, how we can transform ourselves and others, how we also involve our heart, our emotion, our passion, our values and ethics, and how we make sense of the world, and what kind of concepts and theories are relevant and can help us become more engaged, more empowered, more connected, and more effective in our actions, and not just in changing our own behavior, but also trying to change the structures around us that make it sometimes very difficult to live more sustainably. We do live in a world where living unsustainable lives is made easy and living sustainable lives is made difficult. So it's not just about our personal change and our own behavior, it's also about changing the structures that kind of force us to live in certain ways. And we sometimes refer to that as transgressive learning. And seeing education, learning, capacity building as a continuous process in finding a more sustainable way of being, without pretending that we'll ever find what the most sustainable way of living is, but that we have a moral duty to be looking for it as a human species. So to wrap up, we live in a world which is characterized by high levels of complexity and uncertainty. for where we do not have prescribed, predetermined, closed, fixed answers, but we need to figure them out together. There's a lot of confusion, ambiguity, and there's what you might call the extinction of truth, which leads to a lack of trust in science and in government. The role of digital technologies in that is one that is quite dubious at the moment. Also because the development in the technology goes very fast and we haven't as a human species caught up with that development, and we need to learn to live with that technology in ways that are more mindful, critical, and caring than has been the case so far, generally speaking. So there is hyperconnectivity through these devices, but there's also erosion of meaning, short attention spans, loss of place, and viral nonsense that spreads rapidly. Dominant neoliberal economic forces accelerate inequity and material values that normalize and breathe unsustainability. And therefore we need to have this continuous learning in a reflexive society where we can recalibrate sustainability, regenerate ecological systems, and where we can create lifestyles that are grounded in social well-being, where people can live equitably, healthily, without overstepping the ecological boundaries. This is the challenge at hand. In session 2, we're going to be talking about how these ICTs can become drivers of a more sustainable world as opposed to a more unsustainable world. If you have any questions, go to the Brightspace for this course, in the discussion forum that I've created. You can post your questions and I will respond to them. You can also send me an email at arjen.wals@wur.nl.